so that this webinar is being recorded and that you are aware of that. We are grateful today to have a wonderful panel from Delaware Forest Service, and it's my honor to introduce Keisha Bronskill. Keisha and I have been working together on this webinar series. She also serves on the Coastal Training Program Advisory Committee. And I failed to introduce myself, I think. So my name is Jennifer Holmes, and I am the Coastal Training Program Coordinator for the Delaware National Estuarine Research Reserve. And Keisha and I have been working closely together on this webinar series, and we look forward to hopefully seeing you at future ones. Keisha is also the Urban Forestry Program Coordinator, and I'm going to turn it over to Keisha to introduce the rest of our panel and the video presentation. Keisha?
Thank you, Jennifer. Hopefully you all can hear me. When we were organizing this program, we thought that it was best to show a video as opposed to a PowerPoint presentation that highlights forestry, also highlights our foresters in the field, and introduce our updated forest action plan. So you'll see a video here shortly, and I just want to introduce Mike Valeni, our forestry administrator, who will be in the video, Sam Topper, who is our stewardship program coordinator based out of Redden State Forest. Chris Miller is our Kent County forester and the manager of Tabor State Forest. And Jim Dobson is the Northern Region forester and also the Blackbird State Forest manager. And also I want to, before I begin the video, I also wanted to acknowledge some of the other forestry staff that are on this call today who may want to join into the discussion after the video. We have Kyle Hoyd on the line, who's our assistant forestry administrator, as well as Bill Siebold, our forest health specialist, and John Peterson, who is our Delaware Forest Service information officer. So with that, I'll begin the video. Stand by.
I'm going to pass the presentation on to you. Just one second. Okay, you should be good.
Hello. Hello. The Delaware Forest Service currently manages 3 state forests in Delaware. Blackbird State Forest is in Newcastle County and is about 6,000 acres in size. And up there, it's mostly hardwoods. In southwestern Kent County, we have Tabor State Forest, and that's the smallest of the 3 at only about 1,200 acres. In Sussex County is Redden State Forest, coming in at about 14,000 acres. Redden is mostly pine and mixed hardwoods. State forests are managed for multiple use. In fact, we have a lot of people coming to our state forests for recreational purposes, hiking, bird watching, horseback riding, and just enjoying nature. We also have demonstration areas for forest landowners who want to see what it's like to do certain management prescriptions in the forest. So we invite everybody to come to the state forests and enjoy them. We do a little bit of harvesting, but you probably wouldn't notice it because we manage sustainably and we grow far more trees and wood fiber than we harvest in any given year. So we strive to maintain a healthy forested environment for all Delawareans to enjoy. Our mission is to conserve, protect, and enhance Delaware's forests through education, management, and professional assistance. Delaware has more forested areas now than in the early 1900s, but since the peak acreage of 454,000 acres in 1953, we have lost 95,000 of those acres. And that equates to about 1,500 acres of forest land lost per year. Currently, we are about 359,000 acres of forest land. That's roughly 30% of the state has held steady for the last 10 years. The primary cause of loss of forest land is development. For the most part, though, forests in Delaware are privately owned. About 80% of forest lands in Delaware are privately owned. So we try to reach out, the Delaware Forest Service tries to reach out to these forest landowners so that they can have a management plan and they can manage sustainably. The good news is that there are many entities in Delaware looking to conserve valuable forest lands. Through fee simple purchases and easements, we have made good progress in recent years protecting large blocks of forests that are so important to forest ecosystem functionality. One of the major challenges we face, however, is forest fragmentation and the shrinking of the average privately owned forested parcel size. Many private forest landowners would pay closer attention to active quality forest management if Delaware had a thriving forest products industry. That is something the Delaware Forest Service is working on to improve and expand. Our newly revised Forest Action Plan will guide us and our partners in protecting and enhancing all those wonderful natural benefits forests provide. During the assessment stage of developing the action plan, 4 primary forest issues were identified as key items to focus on. The first and foremost, of course, is forest health and functionality. You have to have healthy forests as a base to work on. The second issue is forest markets. You have to have healthy forest markets. Otherwise, forest landowners may convert their forest land to non-forest uses. And if you do have a healthy forest industry, you have to maintain sustainability in your forest management. And foresters know how to do that. We don't cut trees, we grow trees. And then the fourth issue that was identified is public awareness and appreciation for forests. They have to understand that forests are hugely important to the health and welfare of all Delawareans. So the Delaware Forest Stewardship Committee helped develop 22 strategies to address those 4 primary issues. And embedded within those strategies are 108 performance goals or measurements of success. These attainable goals will be our primary focus for the next 10 years. But that doesn't mean we're not going to adapt to changes. So keep in mind that in forest management and protecting forest, it's a continuous process, and it's a long-term process. And we strive to protect as many working forests as possible. Healthy forests provide a healthy living environment for all Delaware citizens and should be viewed as a critical part of our state's infrastructure.
You know, there's a handful of different goals that we have, but largely they fall under, I think, a more appropriate general term of just multiple use management. That's the overarching goal that we have here at the State Forest. It means that we're trying to provide opportunities for all uses. That's important to us because that's what we're promoting to private landowners, so we're trying to lead by example. So some examples of multiple use management, some of the things that we focus on here as part of our multiple use management is wood products, recreation, things like hiking, horseback riding, camping. Also water quality, so we like to take care of our streams, ponds, lakes. That kind of ties into other habitat sources. And then, of course, you know, cultural, historical sites as well. So we're trying to provide opportunities to manage for all of them in a way that minimizes conflict.
At Tabor State Forest, we obviously manage forests, but our main secondary goal that we've spent a lot of time managing is, since we're in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, actually the only in Tabor, we've done quite a bit for water quality and trying to bring back the hydrology for the historically that was on the property prior to it being tax ditched. There was approximately 13 water control structures put in to hopefully improve water quality for the Chesapeake Bay eventually.
So in urban and community forestry, we've noticed in the past 10 years, certainly more urban forests. There's more communities that are being created through development, and our urban forests are always growing. So I would say that's probably the biggest change that we've seen in urban forestry over the past 10 years.
The ways our forest has been changing that I feel are bad are parcelization and fragmentation, where our blocks of forest are getting smaller and the blocks of ownership within those blocks are getting smaller. That makes managing them more difficult, particularly when the types of landowners are different and their goals are different. Forests operate at a much larger unit than what we're seeing now. So that's been a bad change. Some of the good changes is, generally speaking, our forests are getting larger, older, and more timber resource available, more variety of wildlife habitat available. So there's been a handful of changes, good and bad.
One of the major stressors observed in the hardwood forest of northern Kent and Newcastle County in the past few decades are, one, the decline of the red oak family species, especially red oak, southern red oak, black oak, pin oak, and most of this is due to the influx of bacterial leaf scorch, which is initial BLS. Number two would be the absence of oak propagation in the understory and the mid-canopy of our forest, which is primarily due to the physiological properties of the oak species itself. Their ability to compete with the faster-growing species such as sweet gum, tulip poplar, and red maple make them vulnerable to suppression by those species.
A real stressor is deer, actually. They really eliminate a lot of the undergrowth in areas that are really heavily in deer. Of course, humans are a main stressor for forests, whether it's through logging or just through littering or trash. And then invasive species, and that's come into it from either they're changing the forest composition from, the emerald ash borer is obviously going to take its toll on ash forests, to some of the oak species such as like gypsy moth. It's not necessarily a problem now, but it was a big influencer previously. And just these species that our forests aren't really equipped to deal with.
We do see a lot of stressors as it relates to forest health in urban and community forestry. And we really encourage communities and landowners to plan and manage what they have in order to mitigate for those stressors. So, for example, planting more tree species, a biodiversity, an abundance of species, and not just plant a monoculture. We also encourage homeowners to make sure that they're doing regular maintenance, such as pruning, properly mulching, and watering to help with alleviating some of those stressors and keeping an eye on the trees that they have in their urban forest.
It's important, I think, to remember that what occurs on the coast in terms of land use is important for all those processes, particularly surface water flow, that occur farther inland. So coastal forests are important, and those forested wetlands are important for flooding prevention, for flooding mitigation, and for surface and subsurface flow. So what I recommend to landowners is the only thing that we can really do on the time scale that we have to influence, and that's tree planting. So plant buffers, try to create forests, particularly forested wetlands, in the areas where land meets water, and try to help influence positive surface flow. You know, the subsurface stuff, the development pressure, you know, those are problems that the individual landowner has very little influence on. The only thing we can do is try to plant trees in strategic places that'll help with that land-water interface and with surface flow.
So, for example, if a landowner has a wet space in their lawn and no longer want to mow that space, then, you know, we would recommend that they would plant something that would prefer wet feet or would be more adaptable to some wet space. And in that case, they would create certainly more tree canopy, which is a desired goal for our program, as well as create wildlife habitat and help with their flooding issues or their erosion issues in that space.
We've done a lot of hydrology work here to eliminate water from our properties. These aren't always well maintained, and sometimes it seems like we have, once they start going downhill, we start having more flooding issues, or they're just not maintained at all, and our goals have changed, and then we have these problems. Typically, you can go back and look at the land use history and kind of make a determination on really what to do next based on the history of it, the history of where the water really wants to be, and then you can go from there. Some forests are meant to deal with a certain amount of water. Some forests aren't. We see that forests that get more water inputted into it, even if it is a forested wetland, it can only hold so much. So if you're constantly injecting a stormwater into a certain area that even if it is a forested wetland, that has water on it 6 months of the year, eventually those trees are going to die. So you have these focused areas where the stormwater actually kind of goes through or ends up sitting, and that affect forests greatly, even if it is a forested wetland.
We do see in these settings the ability for homeowners and landowners to kind of push the envelope as far as tree species adaptability. So, for example, in the Wilmington area, you'll see a bald cypress, for example, planted as a street tree. Or you may see a crepe myrtle planted as a yard tree. So really in these urban types of settings or these communities, you will see some species that you wouldn't typically see in our natural forested areas, occurring in our natural forested areas. Urban and community forestry is kind of the opportunity to plant a range of tree species, and it's an opportunity to plant different species for biodiversity reasons so that we can help in curbing that management for pests and diseases.
Species composition is important. To go back to the same two examples of flooding versus habitat. Obviously, if you're trying to plant trees to mitigate flooding, particularly coastal flooding, then you need species who are evolved to thrive in that environment, and not all trees are, as we know. Very few oaks would thrive in a wetland swamp, whereas the cypress does. So those types of things. And the same types of considerations carry over to the wildlife example. Wildlife are concerned with the same things humans are. They want food and shelter and water, so these trees are giving them the food and shelter. So we want trees that exhibit those characteristics. Either they make fruit or nuts, or they're thick on the bottom and create cover. Those types of things are the species composition considerations.
For more information about the Delaware Forest Service and the new Delaware Forest Action Plan, go to de.gov/Forest Action Plan.
Thank you so much, Keisha. Thank you so much, Keisha. I'm going to be unmuting our panel. I'll be sending you requests to our panel to unmute, so please feel free to accept that. And just one second. Okay, panel, you should be able to unmute yourselves at this time. Great. All right, so feel free to use the chat box for our participants today. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat box. Sam, I see that you put in that you like the guide called Trees for Delaware Guide for tree planting selection. Is there somewhere that people can, do you know where that's available?
I know it's available in various places on the internet. I think the most recent place I saw it was, I think, on a UDEL webpage. I'm not sure if it's on DelawareTrees.com or not, but if you just Google Trees for Delaware Guide, it'll come up pretty readily.
Great. No, we'll also include a link to that in our follow-up email to everyone after this is over. So great. Thank you for that suggestion. So if like I said, if anybody of the participants has any questions, feel free to type those in the chat box. We will go ahead and start with some questions for the panel. And as a follow-up to the video, and we thanks the Delaware Forest Service for the video, and we also put the link to the Forest Action Plan in the chat box. So I know that Sam and several of you, Sam and Chris and Keisha, talked a little bit about flood reduction and erosion control. What are some indicators of success for managing forests and tree stands for services such as flood reduction and erosion control? How do you know when something has been successful?
First, I think is, if your plantings survive and become established, especially, in riparian areas or urban areas or both, sometimes just getting plantings to full establishment can be difficult. So I think the first measure of success is, can you establish the plantings? And then you can go from there in terms of, how you measure that success. I mean, measuring preventative measures is always difficult.
Anyone else? Thank you, Sam.
I mean, just basically what Sam said, are your trees getting bigger? And that's the easiest way. And then are the trees that you planted the ones that are still in there? You didn't have another species come in there and start growing and kind of take the stand.
Sometimes one tangible thing sometimes I can think about when I think of, I'm kind of thinking of riparian, maybe urban riparian plantings is, where they're actually trying to influence surface flow of water. So sometimes you can measure that during storm events, but largely, preventative measures are tough to measure in quantitative means.
Thank you.
We all know that they're important.
Yes, thank you. We have a question in the chat box. It says, I'm seeing a loss in forest cover in Sussex County as a result of housing development. Does the State Forest Action Plan have specific goals by county? I don't know, Mike, if you want to take that one.
Sure. We do not have specific goals by county. We have an overall goal of trying to protect and conserve as much forest as possible, and that would include Sussex County. We like to target Sussex County because that's where a lot of the large remaining forested blocks are, and we know that because of development, Sussex County is losing forest land at a much faster rate than Kent and Newcastle. So the Delaware Forest Service and partners tend to focus our efforts on fee simple purchases and easements in areas that are highly susceptible to development. So there's nothing specifically written about Sussex County, but the efforts are in there just by default, I would say.
And there was a follow-up question. It says, additionally, I know that the county has been working on new buffer guidelines. Has the Delaware Forest Service been engaged in that effort? And that's in Sussex County.
Yes, I've been on a few meetings where they've talked about the buffers. Well, we would support it, but it's really up to the municipalities and the citizens groups to pass those.
Thank you. It's good to know that the Forest Service has been in part of that effort. So, all right. Another question's come in from Beth Crumrine. It says, and I think Jim, you might be the one to take this one on. It was in the video. Please explain the issue with post oak and red oak. That was from a bacteria, or was that from a bacteria or fungus? And do you believe that is possibly from climate change? Has it been occurring in other states?
Well, as it says, bacterial leaf scorch, it is a bacteria that is spread by leaf hoppers. Whether it's due or not to climate change is unknown. It has been around for the past 10 or 15 years. And we have seen about mortality rates of about probably 10 to 15% of our oak population, and which is increasing on a yearly basis. And as far as whether we do recommend planting white oak, and one of the red oak species that doesn't get BLS is a willow oak. So I've been using a lot of willow oak and white oak in my plantations on Blackbird.
Great. You answered the second part of that question, so that's great. He had asked about alternative planting, so white oaks and willow oaks. So that's great. Thank you for helping with that.
Well, post oak, it says BLS affecting red oak. It's not post oak. Post oak is a white oak. The white oak family.
Correct. So it's not in the white oaks, it's in the red oaks.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you for that clarification. And
I
thank
can
you.
add to that, though.
Go ahead, Sam.
There are many different, unfortunately, there are many different insect and disease problems afflicting oaks of both the red oak and the white oak group right now, have been for some time. Oaks just seem to be assaulted on more than one front over the last decade or two. One of the things that we're seeing kill more oaks than BLS, at least down here in the southern part of the state, is hypoxylon canker, a fungus that attacks oaks across all the groups, and in fact attacks many hardwoods. So it's not just BLS. Oaks just seem to be having a hard time right now. My opinion is that a lot of it is the result of an overarching drought stress and other climate-like changes. For example, we're talking about ghost forests or changes in hydrology in our coastal forests. So a combination of hydrology changes and drought stressors, I think, are causing a lot more problems for oaks than just BLS. So what you may be seeing on your property may not be BLS, but it's still important.
Great. Bill Seibold also chimed in and said that he agrees, Sam. They have a shorter lifespan and they are being affected by succession issues, as Jim Dobson had said.
Hey, I'd like to chime in a little bit, because I was around when they first identified bacterial leaf scorch in just a few trees up in a small neighborhood in Wilmington, and it spread very rapidly. And I think they still think it's an invasive species or an exotic disease that doesn't belong here. And really, the red oaks are susceptible, especially northern red oak. And it's a 1-2 punch. The bacterial leaf scorch clogs up the vascular system and weakens the tree. Then the hypoxylon canker, which is usually not considered a primary fungal problem in forestry, but a secondary, where the tree gets weakened by some other reason, and then this hypoxylon canker comes in and finishes it off. So it's really a tough situation, because there are no control measures for that right now.
Thank you for that additional information.
But we are still planting some oaks in many of our plantings, right, Mike? Right, Jim?
Yes, yeah. And it's okay to plant some red oaks too, but I wouldn't plant my whole neighborhood in red oaks. I would have a lot of variety and go easy on the red oaks, because we don't know what's going to happen in 50 or 100 years from now.
Yeah, so that was going to be a follow-up question that I had, and I do see the other questions in the chat box, and we will get to those. But in terms of restoration, and I know we have some land management entities, folks representing those entities on the call today. are there suggestions as it relates to restoration projects and forest restoration projects in terms of species, planting species, choosing species as it relates to some of these disease issues? And if you had any suggestions or thoughts, I know it depends on habitat and a lot of different factors, but.
We like to plant diversity, a diverse species set. So you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, let alone say you're not going to have just an oak, a sole red oak planting or a sole white oak planting. You're going to mix the species up and find species that like kind of to cohabitate with each other in general, and then combine them, and then hopefully have a successful planting.
And unfortunately, our recommended species list seems to be getting smaller and smaller as we get new pests. For example, with this emerald ash borer, we think it's going to have a heavy toll on our ash resource. So we would not recommend planting a lot of ash trees in a planting project right now. So.
And just I'm in on the urban and community front. We're the same. We recommend species diversity. In a lot of our communities, especially the established ones up north, we see older, mature trees that or streets just planted in all one species, right? So just as Mike was just referring to, all ash on Ash Street and all elm on Elm Street. So we're trying to slowly transition homeowners and communities to make the selections that are more appropriate and just diversify as they fill in those plantable spaces in their communities.
A mistake that I see sometimes is people think about selecting trees based on the site that they currently have, and especially in long-term restoration projects, you have to plan for the site that you anticipate, decades from now. Trees last a long time, and the effective lifespan of these types of projects are decades. And when we start talking about doing these types of projects in coastal areas, we can, for those of you who expect continued sea level rise or continued sinking of the coastal areas, the coast or those forested interface wetland forests are going to migrate. So plant, for the site you're going to have decades from now, not the site you have now.
So that's a really good point, and that brings us into some of the other questions in the chat box. It says, with climate change comes an increase in sea levels, which you just touched on, Sam, which of course can impact soil salinity. Have you seen a change in tree species or health impacts of specific trees in the coastal and riparian areas as it relates to sea level rise, I'm assuming, and maybe soil salinity issues?
They're I assume talking about like the ghost forest phenomenon. There's a lot of research being done on that, and salinity is certainly a factor, I believe, among the folks who are studying that. We do have some of those ghost forests here in Delaware, and my observations of them is not that it's changing species composition, it's just erasing entire forests.
And just to let everyone know too, as part of this webinar series, we do have a webinar focused on research coming up in April, and one of the topics is ghost forests. We have a Noah Davidson fellow working here at the reserve looking at ghost forests. So we will be actually talking about that, and hope you'll be able to join us for that particular webinar as well. And a follow-up question, let's see, or another question, I'm sorry. Is there a standard methodology to assign value to forest conservation or restoration to increase private incentives for conservation efforts? So is there a standard methodology to assign value to forest conservation and restoration?
I don't know if there's a standard one, but I know if you're going for cost share through the through Equip or something, they rank that they put a value on your property and rank it through their whatever their terminology is or whatever their formula is. They rank it through that to give and more incentives for some property to be managed more intensely than others.
I've been involved in various committees over the years at the regional and national level to try to better convey the message to the general public of the value of trees from a conservation standpoint. It's really difficult to do, and none of the efforts that I've seen or been a part of have borne a lot of fruit. In my head, I picture something like iTree does for urban, for those folks who are familiar with iTree, where they can really easily and effectually package the impact of the trees that are around people from a conservation value standpoint. We don't have anything like that at the traditional forest scale or the traditional forest perspective, but it certainly could help.
Thank you so much, Sam, too, as Keisha's smiling, I know, because also part of this webinar series, we are looking at bringing some more information on how to utilize iTree. And so thank you for bringing that up. So thank you. So the next question is from Margaret Moore. How do you plan for rising sea levels and sinking land issues in Delaware? We'll make it that specific to forests because that's a big topic for a lot of different issues, but we'll say for forests today. And do you assume that global warming will guide your suggested plantings? So in other words, would you change maybe your planting suggestions based on changes in climate and global warming?
I mean, to an extent, sure. I mean, just like we talked, I think it's the same thing we talked about a few minutes ago. We're trying to match our species to the sites, and we're trying to do that both short-term and long-term. Hydrology is one factor, climate and temperature and rainfall is another. So for those folks who are doing plantings, if they believe that, the temperature is going to significantly or the climate is going to significantly change in their site, then they should plant for that. Delaware has an advantage there as we're kind of in that transition between a northern and a southern species or ecotypes anyway. So if, long-term climate patterns change such that we see species migration on the large scale, Delaware's in the perfect spot for that anyway.
And I think that goes back to your point earlier, Sam, as well. And I think, Chris, you may have touched on this as well, is planning for the future, that these forests are, is not for the here and now, but maybe, 10, 50, 20, 30, 100 years from now, and what those compositions look like. So I think that goes back into what you were saying earlier for planning for what the future looks like and not necessarily what is currently present or historic. Would you say that's fair to say, or no? Did I misunderstand?
That's probably right.
Okay.
I mean, Delaware has a long history, though, of playing with rivers and marshes and all this kind of stuff through mosquito ditches, through, in King County, the murder kill and the St. Jones has been straightened. So, if you want to see what salinity does or rise in salinity, you can go up to the head of the St. Jones and look and see what we did to the Atlantic white cedar forests up there. So we kind of have this. We know what's going to happen. It's just how long is it going to take to get there and all of that. So it's kind of just wait and see how much it actually does rise and then plan from there.
There was another one in the chat box I think was linked, and Beth, you may need to clarify a little bit, but she says as climate continues to change, it may be worth considering temperature change through time, which you just alluded to, Sam. And she has loblolly pine ? Beth, I'm sorry, you want to clarify about your loblolly pine? You can certainly come off of mute.
Yes, I'm just thinking, as temperature continues to increase, when you look at that, we're really anticipating to see changes even within the next 20 to 50 years, certainly. And some of these trees last for a very long time. What might be some recommended trees that maybe have a higher tolerance for higher temperatures? Just a thought.
Well, I'll add on to what Sam said about the transitional zone. So, loblolly pine grows naturally from Kent County, Delaware, all the way down to Florida. So it has a wide range of tolerances to temperatures, humidities, and that kind of thing. So over the long term, I think Delaware is in a really good position because if there is a shift in the vegetation, it's not going to be so abrupt because we have both the northern species and the southern species. So I don't know if I would go start planting longleaf pine in great abundance here because that species occurs further south and it's kind of specific in what it needs. So it's like you're rolling the dice and you're taking a chance. So I don't know if from our point of view, for the state forest anyway, we're just looking mainly at 5 to 10 years into the future, not so much 50 or 100 years.
Loblolly pine's a good example. Like Mike said, trees are more resilient than others in terms of the range of habitats that they can live in and thrive in. Loblolly pine is quite flexible. It can live, in hot or cold, wet or dry climates. One of the things I think we can do as we're considering planting trees is look at the native range of the tree you're considering. The larger native range that tree has, particularly with regards to latitude, the more resilient it's going to be if and when temperature and climate changes significantly. So as you're selecting trees, look how resilient and flexible it is in its native range, and that might help zero in on trees for sites you believe are going to change significantly.
There's a question.
Thank you so much. We're going to be doing some funding at some point in the future to do some planting, and I think that this is really important. And Keisha is going to be part of helping with that as well. So I think choosing for the site-specific trees are going to be really important, and maintenance is going to be really important as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Beth.
I think it's also important to note, I know we're talking about forested land as traditionally large forested lands, but certainly as I kind of mentioned in the video, there is that flexibility in urban settings and in communities with species. So that's also something to take into consideration that like I mentioned, we're seeing areas where we can plant certain species that, falling in that transition zone that Mike and Sam were just talking about, we can plant, there's a beautiful longleaf pine up at UD's campus, but it's planted right up against, a building or near to a building, but that building is also near to a parking lot. So it has a perfect microclimate, for that species. So I'm just simply saying that it is something to consider when you're planting in those urban and community settings as well.
Thank you for that clarification. We have another question from Natasha. Is the Delaware Forest Service aware of any assisted migration projects that have occurred or are occurring in Delaware? And Natasha, I don't know if you are you talking about like assisted range shifts, or you're more than welcome to come off mute and clarify your question.
Yeah, I guess, as far as tree species and whatnot, we're thinking about climate change and species moving north from the southern areas, and, assisted migration projects, planting longleaf pine and whatnot are starting to occur further north. And I know it's a subject that people feel 50-50 on. I'm probably the same way, but I was just curious if any of those projects have happened in Delaware.
I've not heard of any in Delaware. I think I've heard of I have heard of some in the Northeast. None of them are coming to my mind right now. I'm not aware of any in Delaware, although We are trying to do some restoration species planting. I know we're working on a planting on Redden, I believe, for shortleaf pine. But I'm not sure. I'm not aware of any migration projects.
I mean, we've planted some longleaf pine in some areas, and it hasn't done very well. So that's the question. But on our state forests.
Glad to hear about the shortleaf.
No, longleaf. I'm sorry, longleaf pine. If I said the shortleaf.
I said shortleaf.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, shortleaf, just as a clarification, shortleaf actually grows naturally here in Delaware. We have a little bit of it at Redden State Forest, and we may be doing some things in the future to encourage more shortleaf. But the longleaf, I believe, has a much more southern distribution, although it can survive up here. And Keisha, you're right. In an urban environment, that might be a perfect place to try to grow one. And I think there's one in Dover, too, along State Street. And the ones we planted with the Scouts about 15 years ago down at Tabor, I think there are 6 or 7 that are still surviving, which is very interesting. It took them a long time to get out of that grass stage, but there are a couple there that are still pretty tall, still going good. So
there's a assisted migration project that the Maryland, DC Nature Conservancy chapter is doing actually down on the Eastern Shore. There's been a lot of discussion around it, but I'm sure if you Googled it, you could look it up. But it's interesting. It's definitely an experiment.
Thank you for that additional information, Natasha. Appreciate that. Just a side note, William Seibold also said species with narrow ranges are the ones that may need the attention and help. So just wanted to make sure that was captured. Aaron asks, are there tree planting funds that permit applicants can donate to as part of mitigation requirements? So Aaron, if I've got this right, are you asking if there is a fund that people can actually donate to as mitigation requirements? In other words, companies, or are you talking about?
That's right, Jen.
Okay, thank you. Anyone know, like as a offset or mitigation requirement, do you know if there's any funds that almost like a mitigation bank that people could pay into?
If I'm understanding this correctly, I think there is something similar right now in the city of Newark. They just passed, and we're going to, part of the series that we're providing here is going to touch a bit on policy, I think, in a couple of webinars from now. But the city of Newark just recently strengthened their tree ordinances and protection. And one of the things they established is this sort of bank for developers to pay into when they cannot directly replace trees after development. So if I'm understanding the question correct, there's that.
It might also be worth mentioning the difference between, conservation efforts and mitigation efforts. There's lots of public money being used for both, but there's probably much more private money being used in conservation efforts to help preserve, protect, and even in some cases offset forest loss in other places. But not much in the way of public money that I'm aware of for that. When I think of mitigation, I think of, like Keisha said, developers or large transportation or infrastructure projects that damage critical habitat, and then that mitigation is done somewhere else. My experience is that always comes out of the profit of the project and isn't reliant on donations or public funds so much, but I could be wrong.
And I'll add, it's getting harder and harder to find areas to plant because the population's growing, more developments. Our agricultural lands are pretty sacred here in the state. It's a very important industry. It's the #1 industry in the state. So we rarely get a chance to convert agricultural land to forest land. So we're trying desperately to hold on with what we have. And if we could do that over the next 10, 15, 20, 50 years, that would be a plus. But I think because of the the taxes and the quality of life here in Delaware. A lot of people are retiring here. We've been called the next Florida, which is true to some extent, especially in Sussex County. And that goes back to that question that was asked earlier, that Sussex County is losing more and more forest land, mainly because of development, because people want to live there.
Great, thank you so much. And it's good. And as Keisha alluded to, we are working on a policy piece of this webinar series, and to hopefully bring you more information about what some of the local municipalities and counties are doing in terms of tree ordinances. So we look forward to hopefully that you'll join us for that one as well. One of the questions that we had for our foresters as it related to your reforestation and your sustainable practices, Mike, the fact that you said that that you plant trees, you're in the business of growing trees. When you replant, is there a specific ratio to maintain some of the same communities? Maybe that's going back to that historical, are we trying to match a historical tree community, or looking forward to a future tree community as these changes? But looking for information on maybe a specific ratio in your plantings.
Well, the few plantings that we do at Blackbird State Forest, and Jim, you could chime in on this too after I'm done. We've had a series of projects where we did have some barren land, either meadows or farmland, that we planted, and we favor the oaks because that's what grows there naturally. But when you plant oaks, you'll get some things that seed in naturally, like yellow poplar and sweet gum. But we try to kind of recreate what's already there. Now, in Sussex County, especially in our loblolly pine areas, whenever we do a cut or if there's a disturbance, the seed bank is so heavy with loblolly pine, we haven't done much planting of artificial regeneration in the last, 5 or 10 years, because we get such good natural regeneration, and that's how loblolly pine regenerates. So if any foresters want to chime in on that.
As far as planting goes on Blackbird, because of the physiology of oak, I usually try and give them a head start because they're a lot slower growing. They spend their first 5 years putting root systems down before they even think about going up. And if it's near another forest, the sweet gum, the yellow poplar, the maple, black gum, are all going to come in by themselves overseeded. So usually we try and give them a head start so there will be an oak component in the stand itself. If you do ratio wise, as far as what's growing in the forest, surrounding forest, with percentage of oak, percentage of poplar, percentage, try and work that all in together so where it comes out naturally on the back end, which is 50 years from now.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we favor the oaks because we want to give the oaks a little bit of a head start. And we want them to survive because otherwise they might be overtaken by other species. And you got to keep in mind too that our silvicultural prescriptions, especially up in Blackbird on hardwood, is not to clear cut. So we take a tree here or there, a larger tree, but in its place there's a tree next to it, a smaller tree that's going to take that additional space, light, nutrients, and water, and become a mature tree. So we rarely get the chance to plant, but when we do, like Jim says, we try to mix it up. But in Sussex County or Redden State Forest with the loblolly pine, it's a different type of silvicultural prescription. You have to clear cut because the loblolly pine won't regenerate unless it has full sunlight. So, and like I said, there's the seed bank, it's just so heavy. We often have to go in and thin them out so that we can get a forest going once again.
You also need to take a consideration of really what's around the stand that you're going to plant. So there's a lot of sweet gum, sweet seed trees around it. You should probably want to do something about that before you just go in there and plant, or the oaks that you plant, like Jim said, won't be able to compete with the sweet gums. You'll just have a sweet gum stand.
On a follow-up question, it says, does the Delaware Forest Service oversee any post-planting monitoring for projects that are undertaken by other entities? So not necessarily the Forest Service, but do you monitor or help with post-planting monitoring projects by other entities?
On private land, we do, but as far as other entities, we've helped DelDOT with a few of their projects to take samples for success rates, or measure mortality rates within it to make sure it's meeting within their goals. So we do occasionally, yes.
Any planning I do that I take a look at, and then I think we're starting to take a look at some of the ones through CREP, the NRCS plantings also, to see if they were successful or not.
Yeah, and the several projects that we've done up at Blackbird recently that I got involved with, mainly because it was volunteer projects with scouts, and we went back and did survival studies or survival checks, and we've had excellent survival with those plantings.
We do some of that regulatory as well through our timber harvest permit process. The Commercial Forest Plantation Act that you may have heard of, or more importantly, the seed tree law, the Delaware seed tree law, is state legislation that does ensure that in critical forest habitat types, our loblolly pine type and our yellow poplar or tulip poplar type, we do have a regulatory mechanism to make sure that those communities are preserved post-harvest. So, we just spent a few minutes talking about sustainability in terms of forested acres, afforestation, like Mike and Jim were talking about, or protecting specific communities like they were talking about with the oaks, or like I was just talking about with loblolly pine and the seed tree law. So we do some of that regulatory, but we also do it, just as part of our normal management. Sustainability is one of the main parts of our multiple use management. I see it less about planting and more about harvesting. When we think about sustainability from a management standpoint, it's about ensuring that we continually have those resources available, particularly continual harvest resources. So the planting and the reforestation, especially the natural reforestation, like Mike said, as long as we're not asleep at the wheel, takes care of itself. Sustainability is more about making sure that we're not harvesting more than we're growing. And Mike talked about it in his video. We've kind of circled around that theme a couple times, and sustainability, I think, is where it really comes together. If we harvest less than we grow, that's sustainability. So it's not just about afforestation in acres or communities. It's about making sure that we're growing more than we're harvesting annually.
It's more important than what you leave and what you take out.
That's right. Right, and the way we grow healthy forests is we're always planning for that next crop of trees or next generation of trees that are going to take the place of the ones that get harvested. We don't just go in and cut the trees and leave. We're actually managing that forest so that it has this continuous cycles and age classes and diversity of species. So
that age class distribution is something we work really hard at the forest level to make sure that we always have a good continuous distribution of young forest through old forest. It's an essential part of sustainable harvesting. It's age class distribution.
So there was a follow-up question there. It says, is there a way to make sure planting efforts are successful? And that might also go into the question below, because there are, of course, when you do reforestation or afforestation projects, you have different stressors that could either, that might hinder the success of a project. Carol Larson asks, any words of wisdom about reducing deer in populated areas? So that whole successful, there's multiple stressors there. So is there a way to make sure planting efforts are successful? And if you could also talk about reducing deer browsal population.
There's no off-the-shelf answer. Ensuring the success of planting is going to be different on each site. just like these questions are pointing at. On some sites, sunlight is what you're going to fight, in which case you need to be diligent about tree planting spacing and weeding out or thinning out of those species and controlling unwanted growth. In some sites, deer, like you mentioned, like the other question mentioned, are the main problem affecting the success of your planting. And in those cases, the solution is something usually along the lines of fencing or hunting or some other combination of diversion or population control. Some sites, the problem is water, and drainage is your solution. So successful planting is, the factors are site specific, and the tools are used according to that site.
And it all starts with how you plant the trees. If you're using volunteers like we have, you got to make sure that they're planting them correctly. And that's the first big step.
So training is important for your volunteers, right? Training your volunteers.
Yes. On-site training to show them what to do and what not to do.
Right.
Green side up.
Yeah, unfortunately, we have seen roots up in some unfortunate situations. Yeah, so training is very important. And also, Carol, I'm going to be putting in a link to, she asks about words of wisdom about reducing deer population, deer in populated areas, any support from state or county. Carol, I'm going to put in the chat box a link to the Division of Fish and Wildlife. They may be a good place for you to start in terms of actual population questions, unless anybody else had any thoughts on that.
Controlling deer in urban and suburban areas is difficult.
Yes, it is. Yep. Another question, it's about oak, new plantings of oaks. It seems like oaks need a lot of sunlight. Are they perhaps shade intolerant? And if there is select removal of sweet gum and red maple, how big of a hole in the forest canopy, right, would you cut or recommend to allow for most probable chance of success, I would assume, in planting those oaks?
Well, oaks are sort of mid-range in shade intolerance. I mean, it's actually in between species of oak. There are various levels of shade tolerance. If you consider that a large, mature, 150, 200-year oak, its canopy structure can be almost a quarter acre itself. So if one tree comes down, you already have a quarter acre of a hole in the canopy. It depends a lot on what the aspect is. I know on flat ground it doesn't make that much difference, but up north, Newcastle County, you can have an aspect of the hill of southwest, northwest, southeast, which will also make a difference. But a quarter acre to a half acre is a normal size hole, at least a quarter acre anyway, for enough sunlight for the oaks to grow in.
Yeah, I would second what Jim said. When it comes to the oaks, the whole of a mature tree is enough light for an intermediate tree like an oak to grow in, provided the site is favorable for oak seedlings, and more importantly, that you can protect that oak seedling from competition and predation.
For this question about that, I usually go in, if it's a field edge, we recommend going in about 50 yards and trying to remove some of the larger seed trees and taking them out. Whether or not you just leave them there, I mean, that's going to open up the canopy for some of the intermediate species trees or intermediate shades trees like Sam and Jim were talking about, and hopefully that decreases the amount of volume of seed going out onto where you just planted.
We have one last question for today. Our call ends at 2:15, and so this has been a wonderful conversation. One last question, Keisha, I believe this might be for you. Is there a strategic plan for urban planting to increase shade and heat relief? or if you could talk about those issues.
Yeah, certainly our goal, our programmatic goal is to increase tree canopy. We have worked with multiple municipalities to pass tree canopy goals throughout the state, and we have, and they have. Not every municipality has done that, but it's certainly part of our programmatic goals in urban and community forestry. So it's in our strategic plan to work toward that, as well as to get our communities to work on preserving what they already have and maintaining what they have and managing what they have, so that they're not needlessly taking out trees to begin with. And there's certainly a lot of work still to be done there, as it came up even today, talking about development, not just in Sussex County, but in the Middletown area of Newcastle, right? So we do have our counties, that certain counties and municipalities that have stronger tree laws or tree preservation ordinances than others, but it's our goal to kind of help with that through technical assistance, and our communities through financial assistance. So I don't know if that helps getting at that question.
Thank you, Keisha. Just one more question in the chat box, and perhaps I can have someone answer this as I'm sharing the poll for our wrap up. The net growth to removal ratio is higher in softwood than in hardwood. What are the reasons behind this? And just a heads up, I'm going to be sharing a poll, so whilst our foresters are answering this question, if you could fill out the poll at the same time, that would be great. So anybody want to take the question of the reasons behind the differences for softwoods and hardwoods as it relates to net growth to removal ratio?
It's mainly a depression in a decline in the forest products industry, closing of mills, and actually since the 1950s, the growth for hardwoods has far outpaced removals, and only recently, maybe the last 15 or 20 years, has the growth of softwoods outpaced the removals, and that's mainly because we've lost some mills, and we've lost the demand for wood products.
That's the softwoods go a lot faster.
And the rotation length is much shorter.
So right now we're sitting on basically a gold mine of forest resources that have been little tapped in the last 15 or 20 years. And in fact, the size of our trees getting much bigger. And we're actually having some areas of our forest where the trees are getting too big to even harvest now because the soil can't take them. So we are having forests or trees getting into that older growth category.
All right, thank you for taking that last question. Apparently our poll is having some difficulties, so I will send that in a follow-up email to everyone. So apologies for that technical difficulty. Just 1 second. I want to thank our panel today. This has been a wonderful discussion. We also greatly appreciate all those who have joined us this afternoon. Some great questions. It's great to hear all the thoughts that are going into everything from reforestation to questions about monitoring and planning success. And we look forward to hearing more about our forests and more about our trees and from the Delaware Forest Service. We want you to know that there is another webinar in the next webinar in the series is called Forest Resilience Research. Dr. Tara Trammell from the University of Delaware, Dr. Stephanie Stotts from Wesley College, and Elizabeth Powell, who is a PhD student and is a Noah Davidson Fellow, will be presenting on their research that is being done locally here in Delaware. So we hope that you can join us for that. And there is a link to the where you will be able to find registration once that's live. Once that is live, we apologize for any issues today with logging in, and we'll look to address those in the future. We will be sending up a follow-up email just with our post-event survey and with some information about future webinars in the webinar series. as well as any information that we might have talked about today. So we thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to the Delaware Forest Service. Thank you, Mike, Jim, Sam, Chris, Keisha. Special shout out also to John Peterson, who helped with the video. We really appreciate all that you've done. We have recorded this today, and the video is also, of course, recorded, and we will look to make that available as soon as we have that posted somewhere. So we hope that you enjoy your afternoon. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.